They expected chains and hard faces. Instead, chapel bells crossed the wire in the Indiana cold. In January 1944, at Camp Atterbury's western compound, Carlo Bianchi stood with Giovanni Conti and heard Chaplain Maurice Imhoff prepare Sunday. Mass, a tableau that clashed with everything capture and transport had taught them to expect on enemy soil. The bell's tone was thin at first, stretched over frozen fields and the doubled fences, but it gathered shape as it traveled, a measured pulse that found the open spaces between watchtowers and settled along the barracks' roofs dusted with hoarfrost. It had been months of sand and surrender, of rails that seemed to cut the continent into equal widths of doubt, and then the trucks and the new gate and the American sentry who counted them with a pencil, like a clerk, not a conqueror. Rumors had begun during processing, Italian service units, a phrase that bent familiar words into a new form, and a quiet suggestion that some prisoners could work, be paid in coupons, and attend services according to the Geneva rules. The fence remained. The rules were strict. The searchlight still moved like a metronome across the yard. But the sound of the bell cut a seam in that fabric, and through it came the notion that dignity might survive even behind wire. Carlo felt it not as an argument, but as a pressure released, the way fingers thaw slowly under wool, prickling and sore yet alive, while the scent of coal smoke drifted from the small boiler house and settled into the seams of his coat. The compound had a rhythm he had learned in days, not weeks. Wake to a bugle he did not see, line up under a sky that was pale as scraped tin, count in English without being asked to pronounce it perfectly. MPs checked the fence line, the tower. Guard stamped his feet, and somewhere in the administrative wing, a typewriter began its morning cadence, steel arms tapping at speed. The barracks boards were rough and dry. When a sleeve brushed them, the fibers lifted with a soft rasp that carried more in the cold. Giovanni, who had been a cook's helper in Naples and then in uniform, made rough curls of steam with his breath and tried to catch the bell's pitch, humming under it with a half-smile that had survived capture as if it were a private ration. They watched the chaplain cross the cleared path to the little building the Americans called the chapel in the Meadow, a modest frame set a little apart, its door kept shut against drafts that could strip the warmth from a service in minutes. Imhoff walked without ceremony, hands bare to the air for a moment as he fished for a key, the skin at his knuckles reddened by the wind, the gesture as ordinary as any town priest making rounds. They had expected the opposite, iron cuffs, a mess line that punished any mistake, and a gaze that could not see a person through anything but a uniform. Instead, they encountered schedules, posted in clean English on a weather-stained board, that spoke of detail rosters and work hours and Sunday worship from this time to that time, all laid out with the calm of a railway timetable. Dignity in this place was a kind of paperwork, a lattice of permissions and boundaries that made sense if you learned its shape. The Geneva rules were never spoken as a creed, yet they were present in the arrangement of the day, in the permission for Mass. In the quiet way an MP nodded once and moved on when he saw a rosary in a man's hand at the proper hour. Carlo had heard such rules mocked as illusions, but illusions do not have weight. This had weight, and he could feel it in his gloves when he took a folded leaflet from a sergeant who was not in a hurry. He had thought of home less as a place than a texture, the humid press of kitchens, the sheen of oil on a wooden spoon, the slap of sea air against laundry lines, and here, in a state he could not have placed on a map in peacetime, there were other textures that lodged just as firmly. The bite of the wind along the back of his neck, the sting of soap at the wash barrel, the softened thud of boots on hard frozen mud. The bell rang again, clearer now as it came across the open, and for a moment the compound stood inside that sound as if it were a vessel. Giovanni crossed himself with the same economy he used to measure salt, and Carlo found that the gesture did not draw attention. No one smirked, no guard's gaze sharpened. The snow that had fallen days earlier remained in low, dirty ridges against the fence posts, and in the hollows the ground held water that had not yet decided whether to freeze again or sink away. Some men spoke softly about the service units, about payslips that could become coffee or razor blades or paper and pencil for a letter that might travel home by routes as tangled as fishing line. Others distrusted it, hearing collaboration, where officials spoke of co-belligerency, but even their doubt was quiet, held down perhaps by the absolute cold that made talking too long a kind of waste. Carlo did not choose. He merely watched, collecting small certainties. The floodlight clicked as it rotated and its motor gave a low, regular whine, and when it passed across the chapel door, its beam slid over the bell rope and turned the dust in the air into a brief, bright weather. Expectation and reality took turns in him like opposing winds. The wire was real. The towers were real. The rifles were real. And yet a man with a collar opened a door set aside for worship and no one stopped him. And that was real too. It is one thing to read a rule. It is another to see the rule lived as if it were sturdy furniture, used without comment. A rumor had come through the barracks that pay for work would be in coupons, exchangeable at a canteen under supervision, and that this was permitted, not a trick. The rumor fit the other facts without strain. He kept his hands in his pockets. To save heat and felt, under the scratched wool, the edge of the sleeve patch they had been told they might wear on work details. The word Italy, a raised ridge that caught his knuckles when he flexed them. The smell in the yard altered as the morning stretched. Less coal, more wet wood, a trace of something like coffee from a building he had not yet entered. And the shift came with a low contentment that was not joy but a steadying balance, as if the place itself were a scale that could be made true by small weights applied in order. When the mass began, it was inaudible at first from the yard, more shape than sound, a suggestion of voices under the bell's last vibrations. Carlo did not go inside. He stood and listened while the compound continued its routines. The scrape of a broom, the scrape of a boot heel on a step, the cough of a man who had smoked too much tobacco that could be traded for small favors. He felt the cold through the soles of his boots where the frost had set into the planks of the platform and thought of the long journey that had ended here, a line drawn from sand to snow. Somewhere in the administrative block a stack of fresh papers waited, and a corporal turned them with dry fingers, lining the edges, making the corners neat. The day would unfold into more ordinary tasks, and the new words, service unit, coupon, canteen, would tie themselves to places and times he could point to with his hand. For now, he watched the bulletin board where a roster stirred under the slightest wind, and when the bell's echo finally thinned to nothing, he and Giovanni stepped toward the posted orders, boots crunching on the frost, ready to read what work the gate would open next. Their boots still held the frost from the yard as they faced the roster. In January 1944 at Camp Atterbury, Carlo Bianchi and Giovanni Conti stood at the bulletin board on the west side compound, reading the day's orders that listed kitchen detail and unloading work tied to the nearby hospital complex, the paper edges lifting in the light wind. The board had a smell of damp wood and old paste, and the inked letters, blocky and calm, felt almost polite compared to the sand-blown orders that had chased them across North Africa. Men drifted forward in ones and twos, but the movement was orderly, more a cue than a press. An MP watched with his collar turned up and his gloved hands deep in his coat, and the only sharp sound was the dry tick of the watchtower's lamp mechanism as it turned. Giovanni's breath curled into steam and vanished, then returned with the rhythm of a man who had learned to set his pace to another's heartbeat. Carlo kept his hands in his pockets until the cold made his knuckles hurt, then took them out and rubbed them together, the wool rasping like sandpaper softened by use. The roster named the service unit office as the next stop for volunteers, and the word volunteer sat in Carlo's head with a weight that surprised him, neither accusation nor absolution, just a small stone placed in a balance pan to be judged against others. They chose without speech, stepping forward when a corporal with a clipboard raised his eyes and marked them down, the pencil sounding faintly against the stiff paper. Around them the compound's morning widened. A broom scraped a threshold. A bucket knocked once against a step and then was steadied. The smell of coal from the boiler house thinned into something warmer as the wind shifted. A truck idled beyond the gate, the exhaust making a low haze that blurred the outlines of the fence posts. The service unit office was set along the inner road, a short walk on packed earth that had thawed just enough to take a boot print and then hold it as if it were a decision made in public. Inside, the air carried heat from a small radiator and the sweet, metallic scent of typewriter ribbons. The shift from cold to warm made their faces prickle. and Carlo felt sweat gather under his hat even as his fingers stayed numb. A desk stood at right angles to a filing cabinet, and upon it lay stacks of forms that had been squared at their corners by someone who believed order could be placed on paper and then held there by habit. The clerk was neither friendly nor hard. He was efficient, his voice even, his gestures minimal as he pushed forward a form for name, number, place of capture, and a space for a signature that could be read later by someone who did not know the hand that made it. Carlo wrote slowly to keep the letters inside their boxes, the pencil dragging slightly on the paper fibers, a sound so soft it felt like secrecy. He did not look up until he finished, and then he saw Giovanni's signature, quicker, with a flourish that had somehow survived the desert and the trains. The clerk slid across a small booklet and a typed slip, explained in plain words that these would record hours, assignments, and the coupons issued under rules that allowed purchase at the canteen. Coffee, razor blades, writing paper, supervised and logged, regular as the march of the tower lamp. He did not use grand phrases. He pointed once to a line that required a mark to indicate understanding, and waited, hands folded, while Carlo and Giovanni nodded. The radiator ticked as it cooled between bursts of heat, and the rhythm marked time while the typewriter at the back desk began its work, each keystroke landing with a crisp strike that suggested someone elsewhere would later need to know that 2 Italians had agreed to lift crates and scrub pans on this particular day. The slip itself had a texture that spoke to thrift and scale, thin but not brittle, the ink a solid black that would not smudge under a careful finger. When Carlo touched the edge, it caught on the small crack in his thumbnail like a tiny tooth. Outside again, the light hurt for a moment, winter bright and without warmth, and the truck's engine deepened its idle as the detail filed up by name. Carlo and Giovanni climbed into the bed, the boards underfoot polished by boots into a matte shine, and a canvas side flap snapped in the wind with a sound like a flag that refused to lie flat. As the truck pulled out, the compound arranged itself behind them into lines and rectangles, fences and roofs and paths, and then it was replaced by fields cut down to stubble that held snow in hollows like milk in shallow bowls. The ride was a sequence of small impacts that shook the breath out of a man, and then let it return, and with each low hill the cold seemed to rise into their coats as if the air itself had fingers. Along the road a stand of bare trees made a sketch against the sky, and beyond them a low building with a chimney sent up smoke with the same patient certainty as a metronome. Giovanni leaned on the sideboard and peered past the canvas. He did not speak, but when the truck turned onto a paved stretch, his mouth opened in a silent whistle, and Carlo knew he had seen the chimneys of the main mess and the hospital loading bays beyond, squared off like the backs of cargo ships beached for inspection. The truck braked in a spray of cinders, and a sergeant whose face had that scrubbed look of an early riser checked a list and matched it to the clipboard from the office, the 2 papers touching edge to edge as if to confirm that the morning's words had produced the right men. The smell here was different, layered, hot water, soap, a trace of disinfectant, and under that, something warm and unmistakable that made Giovanni straighten, steam-heavy air with the round, faintly sweet scent of pasta starch. Doors along the mess hall opened and closed, carrying out gusts of kitchen noise that ended abruptly each time the latch caught. From the hospital area came the hollow clatter of crates shifting and a rubber-tired cart rolling over a threshold strip. Carlo felt the cold retreat a little from his face, replaced by a humidity that carried its own weight, and he was suddenly aware of his coat's salt marks and the way the wool scratched along his wrist when he reached to adjust the slip in his pocket. The sergeant pointed them to a side entrance where a small window had been set into the wall at chest height, a counter behind it, and a rubber stamp at rest on a felt pad like a tool waiting to make a thing official. A string of men, Americans and Italians both, stepped forward, presented slips, received a brief mark and a curt nod, and moved on in the direction indicated by an arrow painted with a brush that had left bristles in the stroke. When their turn came, the clerk at the window took Carlo's slip, lined it to a printed box with a movement that had been repeated enough to be almost unconscious, and brought the stamp down with a single firm strike that made a sound like a small door closing. The paper bounced lightly under the blow and then lay still, altered but not transformed, a record rather than a promise. Yet the simple finality of the mark ran up Carlo's fingers and settled in his chest with the assurance of something begun. The window slid shut to keep the heat inside, and as they stepped toward the mess entrance, the door swung open from within, letting out a wave of wet warmth that carried the scent of boiling water and simmering tomatoes and turned the cold on their faces into a sting that felt close to relief. Somewhere behind them, the chapel bell measured the hour, thin at first and then clear, and the sound threaded through the corridor to meet the breath of steam rolling across the threshold as they reached for their trays, the day pivoting on the hinge of a stamped slip and a door that refused to stay closed. Steam hit their faces like a soft wall and folded their breath back into their mouths as they stepped inside. In early 1944, at the Camp Atterbury mess, Carlo Bianchi and Giovanni Conti held tin trays that felt colder than their hands and watched an American cook lift a ladle with a steady wrist, the light from hanging bulbs turning the metal to a pale, clean shimmer. The air carried a layered warmth, wet heat from boiling water, a sour-sweet trace of tomatoes, the salt of soup stock, so different from the yard's metallic chill that Carlo's skin prickled under his collar. The line moved in short, dependable shuffles, each step measured by the clack of a serving spoon against tray dividers. It was a music made of small things, and it had the virtue of ending with food. On the wall, a clock's minute hand edged forward without hurry. Behind them, a door's seal thumped shut and cut off the bell's echo, leaving a residue of sound that seemed to hang over the men's shoulders like a shawl before it slid away. The first scoop landed with a round, soft slap and spread into the tray's compartment, a sauce bright but not oily, the steam fogging Giovanni's glasses until he blinked and laughed at his own breath. An American slid a wedge of bread and a spoonful of something pale and firm that tasted lightly of milk, and the smell rose as if to meet the hunger rather than challenge it. The cook did not show interest in anything but portion and cleanliness. He wiped the ladle's lip with a practiced twist and reached for the next tray. Carlo noticed the man's sleeves rolled to the same length on both arms, the line of the fold straight as a rule, and he found this exactness calming, as if standards could be kept by habit even when the world refused to cooperate. The heat off the steam table lifted little beads of moisture on Carlo's knuckles. When he shifted his grip, the tray's rim, thin and unforgiving, left a shallow crease in his palm that tingled like warning and then became ordinary again. They found a place at the end of a bench near the wall, where the paint was scuffed by coats and the air lay quieter. The bench's edge pressed a thin seam into the back of Carlo's thighs through the wool, not pain but presence, the kind of pressure that confirmed the solidness of a day. Giovanni ate with the neat, quick movements of someone who understood that heat, not quantity, does the first work of comfort. The pasta had gone soft in the American way, but it carried a reliable warmth, and the sauce made the bread useful rather than a test of teeth. Near the far counter, a coffee urn exhaled a steady, cinnamon-dark smell that mingled with the soap from a stack of washed cups. The savored bitterness lifted through the heavier kitchen scents like a clean thread, and men rose to follow it as if it had given an order. A sergeant passed with a clipboard that matched the one from the office. When he paused to read a name, the paper crackled distinctly, and the sound registered in Carlo as a polite reminder that this meal sat inside a system rather than apart from it. Carlo reached for the pay slip in his pocket and laid it on the table's edge, not to show it off but to bring it back into his sight. The stamp had dried perfectly, no bloom, no smear, a dark square anchored to the thin fibers as if ink and paper had been destined to find each other. He ran a thumb along the bottom where the paper's cut had left a slight burr. It rasped against the skin with a faint, satisfying catch. The words on it had the weight of sequence. Hours recorded would become coupons. Coupons would become coffee or a razor that made a face recognizable again in the tiny mirror above a basin. The slip did not promise more than it could deliver, and perhaps that plainness was what made it feel honest. Giovanni nodded at it without speaking, then touched the cloth at his sleeve where the Italy patch would be stitched for duty, the letters not yet present but already there in the shape of his expectation. Rituals exist to steady the hand, he thought, and here the rituals were stamps, rosters, lines that led to food, and a bell that knew the hour. When the chaplain appeared at the doorway, he did not intrude. He stood for a moment under the lintel, letting the warmth rise toward his face, and then moved along the wall with no need to claim attention, a man taking inventory of a simple mercy and finding it sufficient. He offered no speech, merely a nod that settled on the room like a clean sheet, and the nod did work all by itself. It recognized the men without dividing them. Carlo followed the movement with the tail of his eye and returned to the bread, which had a crust that yielded neatly and a crumb still damp from the cut. The bell, faint now through 2 doors, marked a new hour. Inside the mess, a stack of trays slid an inch and produced a dry ring as metal kissed metal, the sound so exact it might have been a metronome disguised as kitchenware. The sharpness of it made him think of the typewriter in the office, striking little metal teeth into place line by line. Both belonged to a world in which accuracy did not depend on mood. He ate more slowly than he had planned, not to prolong pleasure, but to keep the day from running ahead of his understanding. Heat traveled down his throat and spread across his stomach, gentle as a hand placed to still a twitching muscle. On another bench, a man folded his hands and closed his eyes. No one corrected him. No one told him to do it later. The permission was not declared. It was understood. He imagined, briefly, the canteen's counter he had not yet seen, and the cups that would stand on it. Thin-rimmed, perhaps, clean enough to accept a face bending toward them. Every detail in the room, how a rag hung on a hook, how a ladle nested against a pot, how the urn valve clicked shut, felt like a small century of peace packed into seconds. The present tense asserted itself involuntarily. This is what order sounds like. He did not resist it. Giovanni's glasses cleared as the steam thinned. He wiped them with the heel of his hand and laughed softly at the streak he had made, then cleaned it properly with the tail of his sleeve. They finished at almost the same moment, bread gone, sauce absorbed, coffee warming their chests with a bitterness that would have been unacceptable in a street cafe and felt exact here. The sergeant with the clipboard returned, his pencil already trimmed to a fresh point. He read off the list for unloading in kitchen pans as if it had waited politely for the meal to end. The mess door opened to the corridor again and let a ribbon of cold snake in along the floor, where it curled around their boots and reminded them that the yard beyond was still a place of wire and command. They stood, the bench groaning once against the floor, and Carlo slid the stamped slip back into his pocket, the paper's corner finding the same notch in his thumb as before, like a key remembering its lock. They stepped toward the side exit where a cart rattled past, and a mop left a dark trail that would dry to a dull film, and the warmth on their faces detached slowly as they moved, following them a moment longer before yielding them back to the work that would turn meals and ink into hours. The warmth from the mess still clung to their faces as they stepped into the corridor's lean cold and followed the rattle of a cart toward the day's work. In early 1944 at Camp Atterbury, Carlo Bianchi and Giovanni Conti moved with the other volunteers past a mop's wet trail and out to the truck that would shuttle them to the loading bays near Wakeman General Hospital. The stamped slip in Carlo's pocket reminding him that the morning's order had become a line in a ledger no one needed to raise a voice to enforce. The ride was short and jolting, the air knifing through the truck bed's canvas gap and salting their tongues with exhaust. When they climbed down the dock, wood felt dry and splinter-thirsty under their palms, and the first smell they met was a crisp note of disinfectant that cut cleanly through the colder mix of snow and damp rope. A corporal measured their number with a lifted hand and a glance at a list, then sent them to crates stenciled for linens and medical supplies. The lid sang a shallow wooden clack when a pry bar bit and lifted. Rubber-tired gurneys bumped over threshold strips with a hollow thud, and the hand truck they learned to share made a soft squeal at each turn, its iron axle asking for oil in a language none of them needed translated. Here, accuracy had a sound, and it was the even rhythm of lift steps set, a pace that kept breath steady and made the cold tolerable by giving it something to press against. Once inside the bay, the air warmed just enough to hold a thin fog that turned breath into brief ghosts. The floor smelled of damp canvas and old soap, and Giovanni's glasses filmed again before clearing as he bent to the first stack of folded sheets. The weight was not theatrical. It was the honest pull of cotton in bulk, the stiffness of taped boxes that wanted to keep their corners. An American showed the safer grip for stairs with 2 fingers and a nod. The lesson landed faster than any word list. They moved as parts of a practiced shape, the crate's rough edge printing a light grit of pressure into Carlo's palms that stayed even after he let go, like a watermark only skin could read. Outside, a gust sawed across the bay opening and lifted the hair at the back of his neck, and he learned to angle his shoulders so the cold flowed around him rather than through him. When a break came, it was short and correct. A man checked their names against ours with a pencil that left clean graphite, and the neatness of those small, dark lines felt like a promise that the book would not be altered after they walked away. Kitchen detail followed, and there the measure was water and metal. Pans rang as they nested. A deep sink steamed and gave off the sting of soap that dried the skin along the knuckles into a fine, pale map. Giovanni settled where heat and order met, skimming a pot without ceremony and showing with 2 fingers how a lid left ajar could keep boil from bucking a pan off center. The steam wrapped faces and rolled across collars, smelling of starch and the faint sweetness of tomatoes that had given up their shape. Americans gave names to tools: ladle, rack, drain board, and the words stuck because the objects stayed underhand long enough to deserve them. In the next room, tray rails chattered as stacks shifted, and from time to time a door would open to let the outside rush in, turning the steam into a cloud that recoiled and then returned. Work took on the feel of weather. Not chosen, but navigable, the kind of pattern the body learns and then marks off in muscles rather than thoughts. The bell from the chapel reached even here on the quieter hours, thin as a wire but certain, and men paused only as long as it took to note the time the way a farmer reads shadows. Fence work came some days, a different grammar of touch and pull. They walked the perimeter with a bucket of staples and a hammer whose face had been polished by years of small correction, and they leaned into the wire to find the slack points by feel. The barbs took fabric if you were careless, and gloves saved blood but not snags. Each tug wrote a line of dull heat across the palm that faded into nothing once the strand stood tight between posts. Boots rasped against frozen ground where the afternoon sun had not reached. And at the corner tower the floodlight's casing ticked as it cooled from a morning test, metal making its own little punctuation marks into the quiet. In these hours words were fewer, replaced by breaths measured out against effort, and a shared economy of nods that meant yes, enough, take the other end. It is astonishing how quickly habit can turn an edge into something to be leaned on. By the time the wind cut down from the open fields, they had learned where to stand, so it went past and not through. Evenings sometimes allowed the canteen line, and there the coupons turned into small proofs that the day had not dissolved into nothing. The room smelled of coffee that had been held warm too long, and of paper that had picked up the oils of 100 hands. Glass jars and tins sat in rows like quiet instruments. A clerk recorded a purchase without ceremony, the nib leaving a narrow shine before the ink dried flat. A razor blade slipped into a pocket felt like a hinge back to the person who had looked out from a mirror before capture. A bundle of postcards had the dry, chalk-smooth finish of paper that would take ink without bleeding. The light was softer here, and voices dropped without anyone asking. Carlo sometimes stood behind Giovanni and watched the coupon book take a careful mark that matched the one in the clerk's ledger, 2 lines agreeing that a small exchange had happened the right way. Outside, the air cooled the sweat still held in their shirts and made the fabric stiffen at the cuffs where soap had not rinsed clean. Work in the hospital bay. Work at the sinks, work along the fence, each task folded into the next until days stopped needing names. Americans taught words without speeches, and Italians answered with labor that held its shape even when no one was watching. They traded kitchen knowledge that made rations reach a little farther, soured a pot at the right moment to brighten a sauce that would otherwise feel dull, and the Americans accepted these adjustments without ceding authority. A quiet acknowledgement that utility outranks pride when the hour is late. Friction existed as it must, and it burned hottest when a man's old loyalties answered a new order with a flare no rule could extinguish. But most of it cooled fast in the water and steam and cold, and the rest laid itself down into the grain of routine like sawdust in a shop, swept each night and back again by morning. The present tense kept intruding at the oddest times. This is what structure feels like on the skin. Sundays broke the tempo without breaking the frame. The bell counted out the service while the compound kept most of its machinery idling low, and Carlo learned how a day could carry both reverence and regulation without splitting. Above the fence line he felt the weight of decisions he could not see. Permits granted, inspections scheduled, rules arranged so that work could be called permissible rather than coerced. And he sensed that each form he crossed in the office had an ancestor in some room he would never enter. Once, near the loading dock, a man passed with an armband whose white had grayed from washings, the red cross still strong at the center. The sight landed without commentary, settling next to the bell tone and the clipboard as another sign that the camp understood itself as something answerable. The day's last task sent them back along the inner road, hands smelling of soap that refuses to leave even after rinsing, shoulders warmed through and then chilled again as wind found damp cloth. At the service unit office, the sergeant turned their book around and added his neat line to hours already listed. Graphite crisp, while in the doorway the man with the armband moved on toward administrative buildings. The pencil paused as if listening for the bell, then dropped its mark with a small, final click, and that signature, sitting dark on the page, felt like the held breath before larger rules stepped into view. The larger rules did step into view, as if the day's neat signature had been a doorknob turned. In early 1944 at Camp Atterbury, the language of policy filtered down to Carlo Bianchi through ordinary objects: a coupon book, a typed roster, a bell rope hanging near a chapel door, while the command decisions that framed his hours lived somewhere beyond the fences and offices warmed by radiators that ticked like calm clocks. Co-belligerent, the word went, and it felt less like absolution than a permission slip with conditions. The American colonel had allowed Sunday worship in the little chapel and work for pay under the Geneva rules, and those permissions were not thoughts but structures that held. The proof resided in frictionless rituals: a clerk recording purchases without comment, a chaplain nodding once at a table and passing on, a sergeant signing off hours as if his pencil were a small governor's seal. When inspectors came through, men with white armbands and notebooks who were likely from the Red Cross, they looked briefly into rooms and paused to ask measured questions, their pencils making the same dry whisper on paper that the wind made on the barracks siding. Policy, it turned out, had a sound and a temperature. It sounded like papers being turned in order, and it felt like heat rationed sensibly in a winter post. Carlo sensed that the rules at the top had been shaped by two vast necessities that could be held in a hand: labor and law. The United States needed arms and food and linen hauled. The law, as written in treaties, drew clean lines around what could be asked of prisoners and what must be given in return. That bargain, he realized, had been extended to men like him who were now labeled co-belligerent Italians rather than enemy prisoners in the older sense. The difference did not erase the wire or the watchtowers. It arranged them into an argument that could be understood without bitterness every time a stamp landed cleanly on a slip and made an exchange honest. He kept testing the edges to see if the frame would hold. On workdays, the dockboards stayed swept, the loading bay clock kept its steady minute hand, and the canteen clerk's ledger agreed with the mark in his coupon book. Not once, but every time. Consistency is the poor man's luxury, he thought, and here it was delivered in forms and stamps and a bell that never lied about the hour. When he blew into his hands on the dock, the cold air bit the skin just above the glove line and made the knuckles ache. That pain was simple and trustworthy, like the tally of his hours that would become coffee he could taste, and a blade that would make his face his again in the mirror. It was not that doubt vanished. It had to be set down deliberately each morning and lifted again at night. He was still a soldier by oath, and somewhere a man he might have followed once was fighting men he now served by rule and routine. The moral geometry did not solve itself. It had to be lived until the corners rounded. He tried to hold both truths at once: that he had fought under a flag that had since redescribed its own alliances, and that he was now permitted to trade work for small goods under the eyes of men who watched without cruelty. The conflict arrived in small flashes. A word from an American said too sharply, a memory of surrender dust and a hand held high against a sun that made the sky white, a report of the front that reached them in fragments with the cold. But it left just as quietly under the weight of repetitive tasks that demanded unglamorous honesty. The sound of a hand truck rattling over a threshold, the smell of diluted disinfectant, the feel of a crate edge leaving a faint lattice in his palms. These small demands had the authority of facts that did not care about speeches. When the bell carried across the yard on Sundays, thin and precise, it braided the week into a rope that could bear weight. He watched how the Americans arranged power so it would not leak. Inspections posted in advance, rosters legible at a glance, doorways kept clear so lines moved, and a man never stood long enough to feel forgotten. The chaplain moved inside this order without ever needing to assert it. His presence at the edge of a room was a kind of permission for ordinary mercy to proceed without fuss. At times, Carlo caught sight of the colonel at a distance, hat brim low, coat neat, crossing a yard with a stride that said nothing to the eye except that the frame remained. These were not men who untied knots with speeches. They used clocks, ledgers, and a daily bell. The present tense asserted itself at odd moments. This is what administered dignity looks like. He found himself storing the evidence in senses rather than sentences. When he turned a page in his coupon book and felt the paper's faint tooth, it was a reassurance. When the coffee smell rose clean and certain from the urn he had waited for, it was a verdict. Even the floodlight's motor hum at dusk did its quiet part, steady as a loom, weaving safety out of habit as it swept the yard by measure. Giovanni's faith held to the same simple instruments. He crossed himself because time had a shape again. He worked clean because the ladle demanded it and because order is a way to keep the heart from cracking. They argued once, softly, about what it meant to labor in the kitchen of a former enemy. Giovanni made the practical case that heat and food are not political when men are cold and hungry, and Carlo, who could imagine the counter-argument down to its punctuation, found he had no stomach to deliver it into a room where the sauce had just found its balance. The honesty of the work did its own persuasion. The heavy pan, the hot water that stung and then soothed as it cooled on skin, the tray rails hard chiming as stacks settled into place. These were facts that absorbed moral static and converted it to a useful heat. If a line exists between coercion and consent, it is drawn in the clarity with which a man can see where his labor goes and what it brings back to him. Here he could trace that line with a finger along a ledger line, along the rim of a coffee cup, along the dry edge of a postcard he would send into the world with careful, blocky letters. The inspector's return intervals could not be predicted to the hour, but their manner could. They asked about hours, rations, worship, medical care, and the answers, given in measured tones, aligned with what Carlo had lived. No grand defense, just particulars that matched. One morning he passed them near the administrative block, and their presence felt like a temperature drop in the shade, not unfriendly but alert, skin prickling as if air had thinned. That afternoon, the chaplain's homily, if that is what it was, reached the yard only as a cadence, a rise and fall without words, and it had the same effect as the inspection, reminding him that rule and mercy were both present, separate, and joined. He understood then that the bell did two kinds of work. It called men to worship, and it kept time for a system that wanted to be decent even when it was armed. To say so is not to flatter anyone. It is to note what the senses report when the wind is honest and the paper is clean. As winter slackened its grip, the compound changed its voice. Meltwater ticked from eaves into tin cans. Boots shed a layer of caked mud at the thresholds and left darker prints that dried to gray. The air in the chapel lost its brittle edge and took on the quieter warmth of bodies at rest rather than bodies braced. With the thaw came orders typed in a font everyone knew by now, pages clipped to a board with a gravity that ordinary paper should not possess. Transfers, the word said, and whether it felt like release or loss depended on the minute in which a man read it. Carlo stood with Giovanni under the same bulletin board where their volunteer day had begun, and felt the old silence return, not as fear, but as attention before a step. The stamp in his coupon book had a few unused lines left. The bell rope near the chapel hung coiled and ready. The pencil would descend again to make its last marks, and the door to the mess would open once more on a wash of warm air before they closed it behind them and turned toward whatever waited beyond the wire. The pencil did descend, and the last neat line dried flat, while spring light loosened the frost from the yard and made the mud shine like oiled leather where boots had passed all winter. In March and then April 1944 at Camp Atterbury, transfer orders sat clipped to the board like a small, firm verdict, and Carlo Bianchi stood with Giovanni Conti long enough to feel the paper's cool edge under his fingers and the faint burr of the cut trail along his thumb as if it were reminding him to pay attention. The chapel bell counted the hour through a softer air, the tone rounder now that the cold had let go of its hard grip on sound, and its echo moved over the fence with the ease of water slipping past a stone. The fence itself looked different to him in that light, not kinder, not weaker, simply precise, the way a tool on a bench stops being a threat and becomes a thing that does one job. He went to the canteen because routine had become a way to tell himself the truth about a day, and there the coffee smelled darker and almost sweet even before it met the cup. steam lifting in a ribbon that made his eyes prickle while the clerk's pen left a narrow shine on the coupon book before the ink flattened. A razor blade slid into his palm with the quiet weight of a coin, and its thin paper sleeve rasped like dry grass when he tucked it into his pocket beside the payslip and the small rosary he had learned to carry without exhibition. This is how a place says goodbye, he thought. Not with ceremony, but with the ordinary objects that had come to mean mercy in the measured language of stamps and counters. On the final Sunday, the chapel held a warmth that came less from the room than from bodies there to be counted by no one, and the air inside had a faint scent of candle fat under the soap that clung to sleeves from the morning wash. Chaplain Maurice Imhoff moved through the space as he always had, calm as if the liturgy were an instrument tuned to steady a group of men who understood the value of a rhythm kept. The light through the window had changed with the season and fell in a pale sheet across the floorboards, warming one strip and leaving the next cool to the touch. And Carlo adjusted his stance by inches until the heat pressed the leather of his shoe against the sole of his foot in a way he knew he would remember. The bell marked the beginning and then withdrew into silence that was not empty, a felt quiet through which the familiar rise and fall of the chaplain's voice reached as cadence without needing to be understood as argument. Giovanni stood beside him, glasses clean and held in place by the calm that work and food and time had carved into his face, and when he crossed himself, the movement had the tidy economy of muscle memory. Outside, a breeze moved across the meadow and brought in the smell of damp earth warmed at the surface and cool just below, and that smell threaded itself through the wood and wool and old varnish, the way a narrow stream finds a seam in rock. They did not pretend that leaving would solve the geometry that had kept them balanced for months, but the shape of that balance had become clearer. The work at the hospital dock had taught his hands a small archive of facts, how a gurney wheel talked through the floor with a hollow note, how tape pulled at skin if you rushed, how a rope took a knot best when the fibers were still damp from the thaw, and those facts stood in him like well-set posts. The kitchen had given him a different ledger, the way boiled water lifted to a rolling line that could be held just shy of violence, the way a tray rail's clean ring could make a room feel honest, the way a coffee urn announced itself with a sigh when another cup had been earned rather than won. He had learned to accept inspection without shrinking and to treat a signature as a hinge that kept the door from swinging loose. He had learned, perhaps most stubbornly, that the bell measured more than prayer. It measured hands kept busy at the right tasks for the right number of hours, and it made men legible to themselves. The present tense intruded. This is what order feels like on skin no longer braced against every noise. When the truck came, it did not roar. It idled and waited, the exhaust lifting in a wavering column that smelled faintly of oil and old canvas, and an afternoon that would hold. The bedboards had the same worn mat they had when he first rode toward the mess, and as he climbed up he felt the familiar shallow grooves press through his soles, a pressure that said the wood remembered every passenger and had never needed to take sides. A guard checked names in a tone that did not rise, and a sergeant matched the list from the board with the one in his hand until the pairs agreed. Paper kissed paper with the softest click like fingernails finding the edge of a coin. The watchtower lamp was dark in daylight, its casing dull and harmless, and the wire threw a thin shadow that wavered across the truck's side panel when the breeze lifted. The gate did not swing wide with drama. It opened the length it needed to, hinges making a sound that had a history to it, the iron speaking a plain sentence. Beyond, the road showed a seam of dry gravel where tires had kept it honest, and the fields held green in low, confident patches that had not been there a week before. Carlo touched his pocket, not to check but to confirm that his understanding of himself still aligned with the objects he carried. The stamped slip, cool and thin, the blade in its sleeve, sharp without proof, the rosary, smooth where fingers had numbered the same beads into cents. Giovanni sat with his back to the cab and his face to the meadow, and when the bell rang once more behind them, it reached them as a thinner echo, a wire pulled snug through distance. The sound did not summon them back. It simply finished the counting that had begun months earlier and placed a last bead on a string. He thought of coffee more than of sauce, perhaps because bitterness is easier to measure, and of the hymn he had not known well enough to hum but could recall as a shape that lifted where it should. He did not attempt a verdict he could not defend. He let the senses speak the final lines. The air moving across his face was cool but not sharp. The canvas against his shoulder felt dry and a little rough. honest fabric that did not pretend to be soft. The light on the road was level, without drama, good for seeing without confusion. The fence receded until it was a ruled line laying a margin on the field, rather than a border on his mind. What he carried away did not argue with what he had expected when he arrived. It replaced it. They had come inside wire prepared for chains and found chapel bells that kept time, rosters that did not lie, and work that returned itself as coffee and heat, and a face restored in a mirror. The law that framed it all had worn a human expression through a routine that did not change when men were tired. He did not think of forgiveness or victory or failure. He thought of a door that had held against weather and now moved as it should, of a ledger line that had ended in the same clean hand that began it, of a bell whose last vibration thinned into open air and left room for the next hour to be marked elsewhere. The truck rolled and the chapel fell behind a low stand of trees, and the road took them past the hospital bays where he had learned the honest weight of cotton and tape, and past the mess where steam had turned strangers into men who ate in the same measured light. When the gate's hinge sound faded, he understood that he would tell it to himself later as proof that even in war a system had chosen decency and then kept choosing it one small, exact action at a time until the memory of chains loosened and the bell, thin, precise, faithful, became the whole story.